So with this next lecture, we're going to focus on developments in the so-called Islamic heartland, meaning roughly corresponding to the Middle East. The corresponding chapter actually deals with developments not only there, but also in Africa and India. But Middle East is kind of my area of expertise, so we're going to examine developments there a little bit more closely. And if we're going to talk about, a lot of this has to do with kind of efforts of reform, and much of this, in a sense, corresponding to the beginnings of European imperialism. There's kind of a growing concern that Europe is becoming very dominant in different parts of the world, and also feeling that in some ways, regardless of what area you're talking about, the Middle East or India, Southeast Asia, Africa, a feeling of having fallen behind. That this was partly the reason why Europe was able to become so dominant. So then the question came to be how to catch up, right? So kind of a concern with reform, and then a lot of debates about whether reform meant imitating Europe, borrowing just some things from Europe, maybe rejecting European influence altogether and trying to come up with an indigenous path forward. Very much this kind of idea of modernization. So when we talk about the Middle East, very often historians make this kind of division between the pre-modern and modern period. And it's a kind of division we also make when looking at European history. Though, as I think we talked about at the beginning of the course, if you're talking about the modern period with respect to Europe, pretty much you're going back to around the time of the Renaissance, then looking at developments associated with the scientific revolution, Protestant Reformation, Enlightenment, and so forth. It's kind of like marking a major change in the manner in which Europe was developing. In the Middle East, very often we actually have a very kind of precise point of demarcation between the pre-modern and modern period, and it is generally seen as commencing with the French occupation of Egypt. So we can even, in a sense, say the modern period in the Middle East began on a specific date, July 1st, 1798. And some of you might be familiar with the fact that the French occupation of Egypt would be under Napoleon Bonaparte, and this is before he became the head of France, before the coup by which he seized power, right? And he had actually proposed to the French government a military expedition to Egypt, which by the way, took many people by surprise, and historians still debate exactly what motivated him to do this. I mean, this is, very much well before French kind of imperial activity in Asia or Africa. But in any event, they agreed to it. And so he would head up a military expedition that would basically land on the coast of Egypt on July 1st, 1798. And in very short term, very short period of time would take control of Egypt, beginning with Alexandria. And why do historians consider the French occupation, which would carry on roughly until 1801, as somehow marking the beginning of the modern period in Egypt? And it's because it really made a huge impact on the region in the sense of a sudden awareness of just how much more advanced Europe had become, since they had last really paid attention, right? I mean, for many people in the Middle East up until that point, their what we might call historical memory of Europe dated back to the Crusades, at which time Europe really was something of a backwater compared to the Middle East, right? So suddenly there's this kind of awareness that something had definitely changed in the interim. Eventually they would come to recognize a lot had to do with the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and so forth. Certainly the Europeans had become militarily superior. They were able to take control of Egypt within a matter of days, and at very little cost to their, in terms of lost men on the French side. And so in some ways this would mark the beginning of kind of recognition of a need for reform, beginning of this debate that I just mentioned about, what was the best path forward, and definitely also kind of marking a change in the Middle East relationship with Europe. So we should talk a bit about what happened with the French occupation. Initially, the French indicated they were there to bring about enlightened reform. They even presented themselves as somehow being good Muslims, kind of pointing out that they were anti-Catholic, as if somehow that made you Muslim. Nobody was really buying it, but there was kind of a wait-and-see attitude. Let's see what's going to happen. A delegation of members of the ulama, the religious scholars who constituted a kind of leadership at the more local level. A delegation approached the French, all right, what are you really here for? To which Napoleon kind of held to the party line that we're here to bring reform and so forth. But they were willing to give the French the benefit of the doubt. But over time, it very quickly became apparent that the French were primarily there for their own purposes. Many aspects of French administration were very quickly deemed as being, foreign, the way they would have expressed it as being un-Islamic. In particularly, they weren't too happy about some new taxes that were imposed on them by the French, particularly a house tax. That actually proved to be kind of the breaking point. And you be the judge of whether this is really about it being foreign or un-Islamic, or is simply kind of resented that you're now imposing a new tax, primarily for the purpose of funding the French occupation. In any event, it led to an insurrection, which was headquartered in the Al-Azhar Mosque, probably even today the preeminent center of Islamic learning. So in this case represented the fact that the ulama were kind of at the head of this insurrection. This took place on October 22nd of 1798. French were very easily able to suppress the rebellion, but from that point onward, relations would become very hostile between the French and Egyptians, and you'd see kind of a growing resistance defined primarily in religious terms. We really can't talk about nationalism at this point in the sense of Egyptians seeing themselves as Egyptians in a nationalistic sense, and that should somehow be the basis of pushing back against the French occupation. On the other hand, when I say it was kind of a kind of religious resistance, more in the sense that the French were increasingly perceived as foreign, right, as individuals who did not share the same values they had, which would have been perceived as being in some fashion Islamic. And eventually, the French are going to be driven out of Egypt. And part of that also reflects a growing involvement of both the Ottoman Empire and the British. For the Ottoman Empire, this is driven in large part by the fact that from their point of view, even though somewhat autonomous by this point, Egypt was still technically part of the Ottoman Empire. Rather ironically, when Napoleon had first occupied Egypt, he had raised both the French and Ottoman flags, contending that he was there on behalf of the Ottoman Empire to reassert their authority. As you might imagine, this came as quite a surprise to the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government and Sultan. For the British, it's more a matter of balance of power. And in fact, the British had been involved right from the start. Early on, they had sunk the French fleet that had brought the French army to Egypt. And in any event, eventually the French are driven out. This is in 1801. And they had lost, towards the end, had lost quite a few men, mostly to disease, about 13,500. And we should also note that before they finally gave up Egypt, in fact, Napoleon had left. He literally left in the dead of night. His French soldiers woke up one morning to find him gone. He had heard word that something was brewing in Paris, and literally had hastened back to Paris in order to initiate the coup by which he would seize power. So in any event, at some point the French leave. They are repatriated to Europe on British ships in August of 1801. And almost immediately, the Ottoman Empire is going to send its military forces into Egypt in an attempt to reassert their authority there. And it's actually going to become this kind of very convoluted period of conflict, a number of individuals trying to, kind of take control. In the end, it's actually an Albanian soldier named Muhammad Ali who will emerge as the new ruler of Egypt. He had been there as part of the Ottoman military force sent to take control, but he's now going to pretty much govern Egypt as an independent ruler. Technically, I mean, he will recognize in a theoretical or abstract sense Ottoman authority. So, for instance, he takes the title of viceroy, meaning governor. And as a viceroy, he will govern from 1805, when he's able to assert his control, until 1848, when he dies. But again, only nominally recognizing the Ottoman Sultan, in actual practice, the independent ruler of a very much independent Egypt. And right from the start, he is determined to modernize Egypt along European lines, right? So for him, modernization, first of all, means westernization. And we should be clear, I mean, his ultimate goal is he wants a modern European-style army, right? I mean, he's very impressed by the French occupying force, but he realized almost immediately that in order to achieve that, you're going to need to initiate reforms that are going to be much more extensive, that are going to be addressing kind of economic issues in order to raise the necessary revenue, in order to ensure that your government has direct authority over your territory, so developing a bureaucracy. So, he makes that connection, but again, just to be clear, for him, this is primarily about creating a European-style military. Now, in order to bring about the necessary reform, right, he feels that he has much to learn from Europe. He's going to bring in foreign instructors, at the same time sending young Egyptians abroad to study in Europe, primarily Paris. Meanwhile, back home, in order to generate the necessary revenue, right, in order to fund this military and the other kinds of reforms that he wants to implement, he is going to basically nationalize privately owned lands, including those belonging to religious endowments known as waqfs, right? So, which has the added benefit of undermining the ulama, right? A very prominent social group in Egypt that might have resisted the kind of reforms he wanted to implement. And he's going to use all of this nationalized land, right, wherein the government now has a monopoly on much of the agricultural land in Egypt, to grow cotton, right? So Egypt is going to pretty much be economically devoted to the growing of cotton that will then be sold to initially first the British, but then other Europeans. Initially, we're talking about textile manufacturers in Britain who need the cotton for their textile factories. And this will generate the revenue in order to bring about the other kinds of reforms that he wants to implement. What's unfortunate about this, kind of like what we saw happening in South America, where this kind of economic development is basically defining Egypt as primarily a provider of raw materials, right? So there's going to be very little by way of developing industry in Egypt. There will be a little, right? But most of it is devoted to like the needs of this military that he wants to create, right? So you'll have some factories that will engage in cloth production for uniforms, factories producing munitions. But beyond that, right, pretty much any kind of economic development in Egypt is devoted to the production of cotton, right? So for instance, improving agriculture, infrastructure, new canals, roads, tools, fertilizers. Now, to his credit, I mean, for the most part, he does succeed, as far as, raising the level of production, generating more revenue in this fashion. In fact, he triples cotton production. But in the long term, this is perhaps not the best way to develop the economy, right? Now it becomes dependent on Europe in many regards, right? There will be some other kind of more positive, developments in terms of, kinds of reforms that involve infrastructure, new educational institutions, a teaching hospital. But again, most of this economic development either devoted to, kind of raising agricultural production or whatever might be needed for the military. So for instance, there will be a shipbuilding foundry constructed in Alexandria, right? And we already talked about kind of limited manufacturing, but primarily devoted to the needs of the military. Who's doing all this kind of infrastructure building, construction, and so forth? Mostly peasants who are basically drafted into labor gangs, right? Though, I mean, many of them also will be part of this new European-style military, which is primarily based on infantry, right? So you're going to see large numbers of peasants literally being conscripted to be used almost as a kind of slave labor for labor gangs or for very lengthy military service in this new modern-style army. Now, what's kind of interesting is Muhammad Ali really did understand what was going on in Europe with the Industrial Revolution, which is only now really getting underway, right? It's just that he's not going to try and recreate. You could say he's kind of looking for a shortcut towards developing this military, right? In order to, if you wanted to westernize in a way that took full advantage of what was happening in Europe with the Industrial Revolution in terms of developing your own industry, that would have been a much more kind of long-term project. But he does understand the value. He does understand like kind of how that plays into Europe, the strength of European nations, right? That ultimately is kind of economically based. And he does understand a big part of this is education, right? Which is, again, why he's going to bring in foreign advisors to help educate Egyptians about developments in Europe, but also sending Egyptians to Europe to study over there. And in some ways, this is probably the most important aspect of the kinds of reforms that he's initiating in terms of long-term impact, right? So for the most part, he really, when he sends young Egyptians to study in Paris, he makes it very clear they should stick to technical subjects, right? Things that are, have an immediate value in terms of, kind of military application or in terms of infrastructure, engineering, things of that nature. The thing is, right, if you're going to go study in Paris, first and foremost, you need to learn French. Later on, maybe English or German, depending on where you go. You have to learn European languages. And even though you've been instructed to focus on technical subjects, right, once you've learned foreign languages, you're basically now open to being exposed to other kinds of books, right? You have access to that information, inclusive of liberal notions about things like nationalism, representative government, what it means to be a good citizen, so forth. So many of these students are going to be exposed to many of these ideas and eventually bring it back with them to Egypt, where they will then actively promote them. And to be sure, many of them are very much impressed by what they see in Europe. When they go over there, they go to Paris. They don't like everything. It's not that they want to become completely European. They still have their own values culturally in terms of, religious belief and so forth. But then there are many things that they actually like. Definitely things reflective of scientific advancement. They like this kind of idea of patriotism. This idea of being devoted to one's country, ideas about representative government, that government should represent the will of the people and so forth. And so they want to bring this back with them, but they also realize that, in order for these ideas to really take hold, to take root back in Egypt, they're going to have to change the mentality of the Egyptian people. And probably the best example of, this kind of dynamic would be one individual, Rafa'a Fafi el-Tahtawi, who goes to Paris actually more as a kind of, I suppose the term would be chaperone, right? Someone kind of older fellow, not old, but older than many of the students, sent there to kind of keep an eye on them, though, he's also himself a teacher and scholar. And he's going to end up spending 5 years in Paris with a group of Egyptian students beginning in 1826. And will be really very, very much impressed by much of what he sees there, right? Again, not everything, but the main point is he's going to become very active in promoting many of these ideas back in Egypt, starting with writing a great deal about his experiences in Paris, writing at great length about much of what he saw, things he liked, what he didn't like, very often arguing how much of this is entirely compatible with their own Islamic values. And when he comes back, he will continue to promote much of the kinds of things he saw in Europe as a basis for reform back in Egypt. And one very important aspect of this is, he's going to be very active in translating European works into Arabic. He becomes head of a state language school. So first, it's more about teaching other Egyptians European languages, but then heading up a translation bureau beginning in 1841 based in Cairo, with the idea of, maybe it would be easier. Of course, once you educate enough Egyptians in foreign languages, they could also be part of this project of translating European works into Arabic, so a much larger number of individuals in Egypt would have access to this. So he will play a central role in introducing many of the developments related to Western science, ideas about government, citizenship, and so forth, to Egyptians. Now, we should note, before we leave Muhammad Ali, in this particular period in Egyptian history, he will actually achieve his ultimate goal, which is to have a very effective army. The first time he actually deploys it is on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan to suppress a Wahhabi religious movement in Arabia. Then later on, when the Greeks go to war with the Ottoman Empire in order to break free of it, he will send his troops to fight alongside the Ottoman army against the Greeks. But at some point, he's going to turn his army against the Ottoman Empire, effectively occupying Syria and Palestine between 1832 and 1839, and even at some point threatening the existence of the Ottoman Empire. The only thing that actually prevents him from, just to some degree, annihilating the Ottoman Empire is French and British intervention, right? At some point, they intervene, not only preventing Muhammad Ali from really sending his army against the Ottoman Empire, but also forcing him to vacate Syria and Palestine, hence why the Egyptians leave in 1839. If you're wondering why the British and French get involved, it's primarily, again, it's kind of a balance of power question. They're quite concerned that if the Ottoman Empire were to disappear, if it were to crumble, then one nation in particular would be able to take advantage of that, Russia, and that would greatly upset the balance of power. So reform will continue after Muhammad Ali, initially in fits and starts. Some of his immediate successors not entirely supportive of reform, or at least not reform that entails imitating Europe in some fashion. But things will really pick up again under a fellow named Ismail, right, who is the viceroy of Egypt, right, still kind of nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, believe it or not, from 1863 until he is forced to step down by the British, and we'll see what happens with that in a bit, in 1879. Another term often used for the ruler of Egypt at this time, Khedive. So with him, modernization is basically going to begin moving fast forward. The one problem here is, in order to, really initiate reform on this kind of massive scale, as is going to happen under Ismail, he's going to start borrowing a lot of money. Primarily from Europe, European governments, European financiers, banks, and so forth. He is going to put Egypt heavily in debt. And we should note that, to Muhammad Ali's credit, everything he achieved, he did on his own dime, right? From the revenue he generated from the production of cotton, did not borrow so much as a cent from anyone, right? Certainly not from Europe. But Ismail is really determined to transform Egypt effectively into a European state. He even very famously once said, "My country is no longer in Africa," or we might add to that, from his point of view, the Middle East. We are now part of Europe. And so he, and to his credit, a tremendous amount of reform is going to take place during Ismail's rule. So he is spending a lot of money, but you could say at least he has something to show for it. And by the way, a lot of these reforms, not purely infrastructural in nature, though that will be a big part of it, not just roads, but also kind of developing modern sewage systems, proper lighting for cities, particularly if we're talking about Alexandria and Cairo. A lot of development happening there. By the way, if you were to visit Cairo in the 1870s, it would probably feel more European-ish than, say, New York. But there are other kinds of reforms. We're going to see new law codes reflective of European Enlightenment influence, development of the kind of educational system, including the construction of new educational institutions. What we're not going to see is much in the way of political reform. Ismail is going to govern in a very autocratic way. And this is going to run into opposition from two different, shall we say, ends of the spectrum, right? On the one hand, many among the ulama, the religious scholars, very often have a fairly conservative outlook, feel that, many of these reforms are un-Islamic, and certainly they're not happy about the pace of reform. Then on the other side, there are those who definitely support reform, but they feel it needs to go much further, particularly in terms of political reform, right? Reforms related to individual freedom, allowing for greater local autonomy with respect to communities, and definitely in terms of representative government. Though, by the way, on the subject of infrastructure, we should note one very major project, the engineering of the Suez Canal, right? A canal, very broad canal connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. It's mostly French engineers, but funded by Ismail's government. So finally opening in 1869, and there are going to be major celebrations to mark the occasion. Giuseppe Verdi even wrote an opera, which never actually, it was supposed to be, first production was supposed to take place in Cairo. That didn't quite happen. But they certainly spent enough money on it, right? So adding to the debt another 2 million Egyptian pounds, which at that time is actually quite a lot. I'm kind of highlighting the Suez Canal because one European nation is going to develop a special interest in the Suez Canal. That is Great Britain, and that will become a factor down the road. For them, it becomes a very important link between Great Britain and the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. They often refer to it, in fact, as the lifeline of the British Empire. Be that as it may, the debt is continuing to rise. I mean, there are some other issues. For instance, Egypt getting involved in a war alongside the Ottoman Empire, the Russo-Turkish War, also an invasion of Ethiopia. But the main problem is spending too much money on developing Egypt. And related to that, the fact that they're borrowing money initially at pretty good interest rates. What happens during the 1860s is the price of cotton goes up, largely because of the American Civil War, which basically cuts Europe off from that particular supply of cotton, right? So Egypt cornering the market, the price of cotton goes up, related to which they're able to get loans at low interest rates. But eventually the American Civil War is going to end, the boom will come to an end, and at some point interest rates going up. And by the way, back then we're talking about interest rates, in the neighborhood of 100, 150%. They are, to be quite frank, exploitative loans designed, to make it impossible to have them paid back. Eventually, Ismail will resort to raising taxes. That will prove insufficient. Eventually, selling Egypt's share in the Suez Canal Company to the British, which will effectively give them control of it, 44% of stock. But none of it proves sufficient, right? The debt is just growing out of control. And at some point, most of it owed to the British and French banks, wealthy individuals who are invested in Egypt, and of course, their respective governments. In any event, there is tremendous pressure on the British and French governments to ensure the security of this debt. And eventually, the British and French are going to impose something called the dual financial control on Egypt in 1878, basically in response to Egypt's growing indebtedness to foreign lenders. So the dual financial control basically puts Egyptian finances under the authority of British and French officials. So you're going to have a British official as Minister of Finance, who is basically responsible for what revenue is coming in, and then a French minister as Minister of Public Works. In other words, a French minister deciding how that money is spent. And they kind of embed this in a constitutional ministry that Ismail is forced to accept. Let's face it, a country is not truly independent if foreign governments control your expenditures, right? Control what revenue you're able to take in and then how you spend that. And this is going to tie into a growing sensibility of Egyptian nationalism, right? There's nothing like a kind of them set in opposition to an us to help define who that us is, right? A feeling that, Egyptians are being imposed upon by foreign powers. Eventually, Ismail will be responding to that pressure and pushing back. At some point, the British actually force him to step down in favor of his son Tawfiq in 1879. And Tawfiq proves to be much more amenable to British interests, which is kind of the whole point. So he is made Khedive of Egypt in 1879. Bearing in mind, technically Egypt's still part of the Ottoman Empire, though obviously at this point pretty much a complete fiction. Tawfiq, a useful puppet for the British. He will actually remain Khedive until 1892, at which point he'll be succeeded by his eldest son, Abbas II. But this is only going to further fuel this very rapidly growing Egyptian nationalist sensibility. And eventually, an individual is going to emerge as kind of the leader of this, what we could actually call now a kind of nationalist-based resistance to foreign occupation. An Egyptian army officer named Ahmed Urabi, who I should know, right? He's actually pushing back against two things, right? So Egyptian nationalism at this point really has two different objectives. One is to eliminate European control of Egyptian finances, but the other is also directed against Tawfiq, basically calling for constitutional reform, representative government, basically directed against autocracy. And I think illustrative of this demand is this very famous episode, at least for Egyptians, of a confrontation between Tawfiq and Urabi, right, where Tawfiq says, "You have no right to ask for all these demands, for I, the Khalifa, have inherited this land, Egypt." Right? So basically trying to justify his right to rule is reflective of God's will, almost a throwback to, kind of the divine right of monarchs. And in the medieval period, you had a similar political theory in the Islamic world. Urabi responds by saying, "God has created us free. God did not create us to be inherited like property. I swear by Allah, who there is no God except him, from now on, we Egyptians will never be inherited or treated as slaves again." And, when you first read that, you might be thinking that, it has a bit the language of the Quran, of Islam. But if you really think about what is actually being said here, about the content, very much reflective of Enlightenment thought, right? So we find a parallel with some of the language from, say, the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, right? Ideas about, human beings being created equal, the inalienable rights of men, and so forth. So very much reflective of Enlightenment thought. And at this point, we can really talk about it being a nationalist movement, often referred to as the Urabi movement, but much bigger than him. But really, it does kind of represent this point at which nationalism is really kind of the driving force, what is animating this resistance to foreign domination, and also, as directed at Tawfiq, kind of demanding that government should somehow be representative of the people. Now, interestingly enough, particularly given that very often the British would justify their colonizing of, pretty much half the globe, as, we are bringing the fruits of civilization, including ideas related to representative government, constitution, and so forth. You might think that they might view the Urabi movement favorably, right? As, as kind of this movement trying to promote more representative government in Egypt. But that is definitely not the case. Both the British and French really just concerned about protecting their investment, the investment of their subjects, whether via banks or as individuals. In May 1882, the British and French stationed their fleets off the coast of Egypt near Alexandria, kind of what we call gunboat diplomacy, flexing of military muscle. The British are perhaps even more invested because they're really starting to take a really huge interest in making sure that the Suez Canal is secure. They actually now have a controlling interest in it, in addition to whatever other investment they have in Egypt. And at some point, they're going to take military action. At that point, the French are actually going to drop out. They just decide that they're just not heavily invested enough to really get involved at that level. The British are going to move forward on their own. In July, the British fleet begins to bombard the city of Alexandria, following widespread revolts. Eventually, the British will land troops. At that point, the French have really pretty much committed to not getting involved militarily. The decisive battle will be the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, September 13th, 1882, after which Egypt effectively becomes a British colony. Now, what's kind of interesting, when the British first take over, they make it clear that they have no intention of staying for any extended period of time. They just want to get Egypt's financial house in order, at which point they swear by God they will be in the wind. So that's in 1882. The British will not fully withdraw from Egypt until 1954. I kind of wanted to highlight that because this is not the last time a foreign power will end up occupying an Arab country and promising that they only intend to stay for a short period, but then somehow ending up staying much longer. At some point, this will become in some ways the primary role of the United States in the Middle East. And considering that this kind of thing began, going back to the late 19th century, you can understand why many people in the Middle East are often very skeptical when foreign powers like the United States get involved and make promises about vacating the premises within a short period of time. In the case of the British, one of the main reasons they end up staying has a lot to do with the guy they put in charge. Evelyn Baring, also the first Earl of Cromer, or simply Lord Cromer, will be, and in fact, even going back to the dual financial control, already representing the British within Egypt as British controller. Later, he will become agent and then consul general of Egypt. Once it is fully under British control, he will run Egypt in an autocratic manner. You still have Tawfiq there, right? In theory, still has some kind of executive authority in Egypt, but nothing happens without the approval of the British, and pretty much it's Lord Cromer who determines what policy is going to be. And from a pretty early point, he really promoted the idea that the British needed to stay around, much longer than they originally intended, arguing that, before they can really get Egypt's finances in order, you really need a lot of political reform. Therefore, the British have to stick around, kind of make sure that happens. But as you might imagine, he is going to prove a major catalyst for Egyptian nationalism, right? As kind of a point of opposition. Many Egyptians really growing to resent his constant intrusion into Egyptian politics, which very often, he governs in a very heavy-handed manner. On top of that, you have Egyptian military personnel who end up having a very strong presence in Egypt, pretty much, going around like they own the place. Eventually, matters will come to a head with an incident that takes place in a small village in Egypt, Denshaway, in 1906. And I kind of wanted to look at this a little bit more closely because I think it really does illustrate, how European imperialism often plays out in different parts of the world during this period, right? So, especially given that, particularly British imperialism often portrayed as somehow, relatively benign, at least compared to other European powers. That to some extent the British respected local customs and mores, and compared to the French, there might be a little bit of truth to that. But on the other hand, they certainly were not reluctant to deploy force or engage in repressive policies. In any way, looking at this incident, what's often referred to as the Denshaway incident. So what happened? June 1906. 5 British officers, while pigeon hunting near the village of Denshaway, when they enter the village, they accidentally set fire to a pile of grain on a village threshing floor. This leads to some conflict between them and the villagers. A brawl breaks out, fisticuffs, if you will, kind of an old-fashioned term. And at the end, 5 villagers and 2 officers end up being killed. A 3rd officer dying later from heat stroke. So looking at this incident, and just trust me, even if you looked at it more closely, you probably would come away with the same basic takeaway that, really the British were primarily at fault, and probably the appropriate thing to do would have been to apologize. But that isn't what happens, right? In the end, they actually try 52 members of the village for murder. 32 end up being found guilty, several are flogged, and 4 male villagers end up being hanged, essentially executed, right? Not only are they, the British not apologetic, there's kind of this feeling that they need to make an example of the villagers, that they would only respect force. Even if somehow some of the villagers should have been held accountable, it's, really rather disproportionate to put 52 members of the village on trial, right? I mean, essentially a form of collective punishment of the entire village, which, by the way, that kind of thing is considered illegal today by international law. But in any event, if the point was to teach them a lesson, it had the absolute opposite effect, right? This is really simply going to incense a huge part of the Egyptian population who are absolutely outraged by this incident. And really, for the first time, you see urban intellectual critics of the British regime, very often motivated primarily by kind of a more, shall we say, nationalistic ideological appreciation of the situation, finding common cause with the local peasantry who, for them, this is increasingly simply about the British interfering in their way of life and just being this kind of unwelcome intrusion. And so we're going to see kind of a rapid escalation in Egyptian nationalist activity. First and foremost, evident in the formation of political organizations. 3 in particular are going to stand out. You have the Constitutional Reform Party, and they're already thinking about what an independent Egypt would look like. The idea that whatever government they have should have an Islamic framework. Probably the 2 most well-known figures belonging to this group, Islamic reformers Mohammed Abduh and Rashid Rida. We're going to meet them again when we look at the development of Arab nationalism. Another political organization, the People's Party, under Lutfi al-Sayed, who is the editor of a newspaper, Al-Jarida, which means the newspaper, also a lawyer, promoting more, they're, again, thinking about, the future of a possibly independent Egypt, that it should, the government should be a secular liberal democracy. And then finally, the National Party, led by Mustafa Kemal, who, by the way, nothing to do with Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, Ataturk, different guy. He's kind of like, let's not worry about what we're going to do after we become independent. We have the immediate problem of getting the British out, right? So he's going to focus on that more immediate demand. Eventually, one figure in particular is going to emerge as the dominant political figure, kind of at the head of this, kind of burgeoning Egyptian nationalist movement, and that will be a fellow named Saad Zaghloul. And so by the First World War, he is the leader of Egyptian nationalism without any question, right? I mean, he's the guy who Egyptians look to lead the way. Well, after the First World War, and a lot of this has to do with kind of American involvement and, certain ideas that the American president, Woodrow Wilson, had promoted as the basis for a new international order. So you have this principle he'd actively promoted that is really circulating a lot right now, called national self-determination, right? The idea that every people have the right to determine their own political future. And as you might imagine, many colonized people are going to be very excited about this, right? Even hoping that, if we can send a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference where they're, kind of settling the terms at the conclusion of the First World War, and make our case, we might even get American support for independence. And that will include the Egyptians. By the way, not just the Egyptians, not just peoples in the Middle East, right? This is going to be a development reflective of many different colonies around the world. But in any event, in the case of Egypt, Saad Zaghloul proposes the creation of a delegation, the word in Arabic for delegation, waft, that should go to Paris to make the case for Egypt's independence on the basis of this principle of national self-determination. By the way, he will end up becoming a very prominent figure during the 1920s as the head of a political party called the Waft, and very often serving as prime minister.
Well, the British are not happy about this at all. They've convinced themselves that, in fact, these nationalist leaders, including Zaghloul, do not, in fact, represent how the vast majority of Egyptians feel. They're kind of troublemakers, malcontents. If we can get them out of the way, everything will settle down. Related to which, they basically round up Zaghloul and other nationalists and deport them to the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, which is under British control. Much to the surprise of the British, the whole Egyptian population reacts rather strongly. You have massive demonstrations that break out in March of 1919, demanding for their release and that the Wafd be permitted to attend the Paris Peace Conference. So eventually the British kind of cave in. They release Zaghloul and his fellow nationalists. They allow the Wafd to go to Paris. They're pretty much counting on American support, but in the end, it never comes. In fairness to Woodrow Wilson, it's not at all clear how supportive the United States would have been. By the way, United States, up until now, not a major player in the region. And that's kind of good to know because, currently we often think of the United States, in terms of being, the fact that it's very politically active in the Middle East. There are reasons, Woodrow Wilson might have supported Egyptian demands for independence, some of it reflecting American interests. You get the British out of there. That might open up markets to the United States. One of the main reasons American support never comes is that during the conference, Woodrow Wilson suffers a stroke. So he just becomes debilitated and is essentially not available. At least one outcome of this is the British begin to understand that they are no longer welcome in Egypt. They send a commission to, it's kind of funny, to determine the causes of the disorders. And it's kind of funny. I mean, really, it was pretty evident. The commission pretty much determined that Egyptians wanted their independence and they wanted the British out. And it pretty much was as simple as that. At this point, the Wafd, which is in a sense evolving into a political organization, becomes, kind of the party with whom the British have to negotiate. They represent Egypt. And the British try to negotiate a compromise, but the Wafd are very insistent that, no compromise. The British simply need to leave. We want complete independence. Again, this does represent the popular view. Again, the British decide, well, maybe not. Maybe these guys are just, if we get them out of the way, things will settle down. We'll find someone else to negotiate with. They again deport Zaghloul. Again, mass demonstrations break out. And again, the British are like, oh, yeah, I guess actually, these guys are the real deal. Finally, the British are going to unilaterally declare Egypt independent in 1922. And you might be thinking, well, that's great. Well, don't get too excited because, yes, they will declare Egypt independent, but with 4 reserved points. So Egypt is independent except that the British will maintain control of imperial communications, pretty much all communications that are of any value to British imperial interests, including the Suez Canal. 2, Egypt will be independent except that the British will have control of Egypt's defense against foreign aggression, right? So the British will control not just their defensive policy, but literally the Egyptian army. You will have British commanding officers in charge of the Egyptian army. Egypt will be independent, except the British will be able to intervene whenever and however they wish with regard to foreign interests in minority populations, so determined by the British. So, for instance, Greeks, Armenians, Italians, Jews, many of them based in Alexandria, some in Cairo, will not be subject to Egyptian law in effect. And the British will have complete direct control over the Sudan, which at this point Egyptians feel to be part of Egypt. It's actually like a very important nationalistic goal of Egyptians that, if they become independent, it should include Sudan. But in any event, right, obviously this is not real independence. This is something of a joke. You will have a legislative body, a parliament. The Wafd will become a political party. And there will be other political parties that will emerge. You still have Well, it's no longer a Khedive. By this point, the Ottoman Empire no longer exists. This is post-World War I. And we'll get to that in a bit. But in any event, the individual who had been a Khedive will now be called a Sultan. So in a sense, you have three loci of power. You have a Sultan, you have a parliament, legislative body, and you have the British. But ultimately, the British always have the final word. And while all of this is happening, Egyptian nationalist sensibility just becoming stronger and stronger. Number of factors behind this, of course, the continued presence of the British is a major factor, kind of a catalyst. This kind of easily defines a shared nationalistic goal that everyone can agree with. We might have differences about, becoming, really independent, what kind of government we should have and so forth, what would be the place of Islam, politically, socially, and so forth. But we can kind of put that aside for now. Another important factor, though, also kind of growing literacy rates. Related to that, the proliferation of daily newspapers, weekly magazines, very often featuring essays dealing with the country's political problems, the chief of which, again, the continued British presence. We also have a burgeoning modern Arabic literature, much of it rooted in Egypt. Taking the form of both novels and short stories, and very often featuring nationalistic themes. And then finally, we should also note you have a burgeoning film industry, also recording industry, but the film industry very rapidly taking off. And in fact, today, if you see a film in the Arabic language, the likeliest probability is that it was produced in Egypt. Last time I checked, I think the Egyptian film industry is fourth behind the United States, China, and India. Recording industry also very important. Probably the most famous recording artist in the history of the modern Middle East, Kulthum, becoming very prominent at this point. She's of Egyptian origin, but will become beloved throughout the region. And really, you really cannot exaggerate how famous she is. I'm trying to think of, is kind of like rolling. And I'm probably dating myself here, but Elvis Presley, the Beatles, Frank Sinatra, and Michael Jackson into one, and still not achieving the level of popularity she enjoyed, continues to enjoy in the Middle East. In any event, that ends the first half of our lecture. With the second half, we're going to kind of go back to the point where we started, chronologically speaking, but looking primarily at developments in the Ottoman Empire. And also a bit in perhaps in Iran, but then also focusing on the development of Arab nationalism. But we're really not going too much past, events immediately after the First World War. That would really correspond to a different chapter. But eventually, just to kind of finish the story, Egypt will become independent. The British finally leaving completely in 1954. So it's going to take a while, but they do eventually achieve that goal. Anyway, I'll see you in the second part of our lecture, hopefully shortly.